By now you've become familiar with two of my heroes, Paulo Freire and Ignacio Martin Barro, two of the sort of the leaders that I think about when I think about sort of a liberation philosophy and movement. Although Freire's work hasn't been too often applied to psychology, Ignacio Martin Barro's work is sort of one of the first to have done that. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about one of my favorite places here in Mexico City, the Zocalo, which I think of as being sort of the architectural embodiment of Latin America, in that it's the Catholic Church facing sort of the political offices, and all of that built on a foundation of ancient history, because the Templo Mayor is beneath that. So there's a story of politics, religion, and conquest. And sort of that's where the emergence of liberation theology came out of. The Catholic Church was a part of the overall conquest and colonialization of the native people by Spain and Portugal. And the conquest brought a very particularly aggressive kind of Catholicism, reflecting both the period and sort of a reaction to the Protestant Reformation that was going on at that time. But I always like to look for the exceptions, and there were some exceptions during that time, and some of the early missionaries really protested the cruelty of the conquest. So there's a number of different examples of that. And later, the liberation theologians sort of regarded this generation of bishops as sort of their precursors. And so that was an initial step. So I like to think that the work you're doing now is sort of part of an initial step as well. During the years of 1808 to 1824, Latin America largely sort of broke away from Spain and Portugal, and that allowed kind of a new Catholicism to develop. And since monasteries, convents, and churches had less contact, they developed their own form and focused more on local concern. One of those local concerns was that of poverty, and that was sort of the starting point for liberation theology. They looked around and saw that the people were often suffering from great need. And they looked at the scriptures and started to make sort of construct a Catholicism to represent the needs of their local community. So poverty as a context led to them to look at the scriptures in a very specific way. For example, they looked at 2 Corinthians 8:9 that said, "He was rich, yet for our sake he became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich." And then some of the Latin American priests began to call upon the church to take sort of a similar kind of solidarity with the poor. And then collapsing many years, the movement continued to sort of have that emphasis for the poor. One of the things that happened is that the theology that developed in this context was different, and they began to realize that it was different in part because of their context in Latin America. And they also realized that that is true for the theology that was developing in Europe. Latin American theologians tend to find that they were not only dealing with different issues, but the methodology that they used was different. Now, I like to kind of talk about liberation theology very briefly, because that's sort of the same sort of process that happened for psychology when the psychologist Ignacio Martin Barro, who was also a priest, started looking how psychology might be different if it was also oriented for the poor. Being trained in the U.S., then going back into Latin America, Ignacio Martin Barro saw the limits of sort of the individualistic models. And then from a vantage point of Central America that was really enmeshed in military repression, civil wars, and profound poverty, he saw that psychology really lacked an emphasis on developing mental health approaches for the poor. One of the most powerful phrases in the book for me is, "What is needed is for our most basic assumptions in psychological thought to be revised from the bottom up. But this revision cannot be made from our offices. It has to come from a praxis that is committed to the people." Think about almost all other therapy approaches. Most of them were developed for the wealthy elite. From Freud, even MFT, with its origins being in Palo Alto, California, not exactly a poor area. I love the way that Paulo Freire sort of took on education and how it's been done. He's best known for his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It was really directed toward liberating oppressed and often illiterate people. And I loved how he talked about the culture of silence, that people think things are just the way they are, and they're not very critical about thinking about how they might be different. And that's true in education, and that is also true in psychology, really, in any discipline. So he felt like we really needed to spend some time breaking poking a hole in that belief. Maybe I just like things that are rebellious, but I liked that he saw education as a subversive force. He said that there's no such thing as a neutral educational process. Every professor that you have has an agenda, has a belief system, and if they're not upfront with that, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Freire said that education either functions to integrate the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity to that logic, or it's a great liberator, and that education can become this practice of freedom, the means by which men and women critically deal and creatively deal with reality and discover how to participate in transforming the world. So a big part, in his view, in education is to think about what parts need to be subverted. I think the same could be said for psychology. How could it be different? Where are the limitations in what we do? One, I think, is that it's often been developed for a very limited part of the human population, and that there might be other populations from which we ought to be considering. Now, Freirean concepts that I think have a lot to offer in liberation psychology, or psychology in general: avoiding the banking concept of therapy, dialogue, humanization, and then true practice over theory. And I'll tell you a little bit about each of those. Avoiding the banking approach to therapy. In a banking approach, knowledge becomes a gift bestowed upon those who consider themselves knowledgeable, upon those who they consider not to know anything. Avoiding a banking approach to therapy would open up new ways to be with clients, similar to a number of postmodern approaches, I think, that trust that clients have their own ways of knowing that can be useful in addressing some of their clinical concerns. It's realizing that they have knowledges, ways of thinking, ideas, things that they're doing right. And that sort of the alternative to a banking approach would be doing more dialogue and thinking of it in that term, and rather than an expert helping someone who is whatever the opposite of an expert is. Dialogue is an alternative to doing banking therapy, and its aim would be to bring about sort of a consciousness about the structures and the things that are in the person's environment that are limiting them, and then helping them to be empowered to change those things. Sort of like Freire thinks about schools as those places where uncoerced interactions could be created. Similarly, therapy could become that type of knowledge lab in which clients could construct new options for themselves. One of the things I really like about Freire's work is his focus on helping people to become more fully human, which really ties in with a lot of therapy approaches like Virginia Satir's approach. Now, if you think about oppression, it always involves the dehumanization of people, and often what it does is it creates a structure where people can't identify the things that are taking away their humanity. Through the dialogue and helping people gain more awareness, you could help them change those structures so that their humanity could be expressed more fully. I love this quote by Virginia Satir. She says, "Over the years, I've developed a picture of what a human being living humanely is. She is a person who understands, values, and develops her body, finding it beautiful and useful, a person who is real and willing to take risks, to be creative, and to manifest competence to change when the situation calls for it." You know, I think anything that hinders the expression of a person's humanity would be one of those things that would be therapeutically important to tune into. Sort of the last concept I'll just mention, and there's lots of other ones, is that of true practice. Ignacio Martin Barros said that true practice recognizes that actions are more important than affirmations. In this context, everything that we could do in therapy that would be meaningful in mediating the possibility of people's liberation from structures that oppress and impede their life and human development would be important in therapy. True practice for a therapist might include engaging in more social justice work. Okay, those are some of the highlights. Hopefully you're really delving into the material, into the course readings. This week what I want to ask people to do is to apply the course readings to the video balance, which you'll find off to the other side. Try and find application from some of the concepts that you're reading and apply it to that video. You can also draw from information that was here in this video, and I look forward to hearing more of your ideas.
Are you ready to play?